You are walking down a cobbled street in 17th-century Paris. The Seine is not far off, but you're nowhere near the romantic image we might picture today. Yet the city has no underground sewer network, and indoor plumbing is an idea still percolating in the minds of engineers. So how did people relieve themselves in public? The answer, as it turns out, lies in an unassuming architectural curiosity: the public urinal, or, as they were sometimes euphemistically known, les Vespasiens, though that name wouldn't appear until later. The wind carries a tapestry of smells, some sweet from freshly baked bread, but mostly not. These were usually little more than recessed niches in a wall, shielded by a modest privacy screen of wood or stone. They were called, and carts cleared out cesspools and cleaned these corners of society. It was difficult, dangerous work, often carried out in darkness. Many vidangers suffered respiratory ailments due to ammonia exposure, though their work was considered essential to public health. These weren't enclosed. Wealthier quarters, like the Marais, considered them unsightly. Local guilds sometimes lobbied for or against urinal construction, claiming that proximity to a drove down the prestige of a bakery or clothier. They didn't flush, but they offered two key features. They centralized the act, and they were easier to clean, at least in theory. But by countless small, unremarkable decisions made by city officials, property owners, and, of course, the humble urinators themselves, the gutters, known as caniveaux, overflow with wastewater and refuse. Men faced limited options when nature called during a market trip or a late-night stroll. The earliest attempt wasn't a device or building, but a legal threat, beginning in the late 1500s and continuing into the 1600s. Various edicts were issued forbidding urination against walls and prescribing fines for offenders. These laws were hardly enforced and largely ignored, but they mark the beginning of an awareness that something had to be done. The streets, alleys, and building corners of Paris became de facto restrooms, leading to what urban chroniclers of the time euphemistically described as fetid inconveniences. The city stank. The stones quite literally reeked. Horses clopped by hooves echoing against stone facades. Somewhere, not far, a man relieves himself. In this world, Paris is bustling with nearly 400,000 inhabitants. By the mid-1600s, in this section, we'll explore how public sanitation in 17th-century Paris was shaped not by grand reformers or bold visionaries. Let's begin with the basic problem. People needed to go. So city officials had a simple objective: contain the urine. By the early 1600s, a more practical solution emerged. Paris began installing small open-air urinals in busy areas. These early urinals were maintained by a small army of municipal workers known as vidangers nightmen, who armed with long-handled scrapers, brushes. Curiously, placement of these urinals was a political matter. Certain neighborhoods wanted them. Others vehemently objected. Despite these objections, the early 17th century saw a steady increase in public urinal installation, particularly near markets, bridges, and city gates. Some reports suggest that by 1650, street inspectors, voyeurs worked under the municipal bailiffs. These men were tasked with walking their assigned routes, noting whether refuse was being cleared and whether urinals were too full. There were no thermometers, no tests, just the human nose and an informal standard. If a passerby flinched, it was time to clean. Most were known only to locals, passed down by word of mouth, or observed in practice. Many were adjacent to or built into structures belonging to churches, noble families, or guild halls. People adapted, just as the city did, slowly and with much debate. But while Parisian officials struggled with how to manage the issue discreetly, the public's approach remained direct and practical. When you needed to go, you went. A passerby might relieve himself beside the outer wall of a bakery, under the very eyes of its patrons. Sometimes disputes arose. The odor in popular squares became intolerable in summer. Something had to evolve. In one preserved legal complaint from 1648, a bookseller in Rue Saint-Jacques sued a neighbor for permitting foul mists to rise beneath the window of learned men. The city's sanitation office, such as it was, didn't yet exist in a formal sense. What's striking is that these early facilities were not anonymous. Urination in public remained an uneasy compromise between social necessity and architectural improvisation. Yet this system had a breaking point. As the population swelled in the second half of the century, even these open-air solutions became overwhelmed. Complaints to city magistrates increased, and who decided that relieving oneself could, in fact, be elegant, endured the sharp notes of ammonia in a summer breeze, and seen firsthand how a city handled public sanitation with little more than stone, shame, and men with buckets. Public health as a concept didn't fully exist yet. These new structures were sometimes made of carved stone or wood, often with a simple dome or roof to keep the rain from flooding the bowl. A few even included latticework, walls, or plantings to obscure the view and dampen the odor. A dirty urinal was not merely unpleasant, it was dangerous. Female modesty was tightly regulated. Satirical prints of the day mocked the idea of women mimicking the habits of wine-soaked printers. A class of men frequently associated with public drunkenness and urination. They had to rely on chamber pots, backroom arrangements with merchants, or the occasional secluded alleyway at great risk to their safety and reputation. As complaints piled up and street inspectors filed their reports with increasing frustration, city officials realized that ignoring the urinal problem wasn't just unsanitary, it was politically risky. And so, by the 1660s, Paris's urinal landscape began to shift from crude stone alcoves to more purpose-built, semi-decorative installations. Some urinals were constructed to blend with the city's Baroque architecture. Graceful curves, faux columns, and stylized reliefs all made appearances. In other words, the city was dressing up the urinal. Most were still open air and unflushed, of course. In a twist only Paris could produce, aesthetic value became part of sanitation planning. One group conspicuously missing from this new wave of civic convenience: women. Public urination was socially permitted for men, but deeply taboo for women. There were rumors of a few brave or desperate women using the men's urinals in disguise or at night. These were considered both scandalous and pitiable. Thus, the beautification of the urinal was not about equality or inclusion, but about making a male ritual more palatable to society's higher classes, especially the bourgeoisie, who now walked through city squares with perfumed kerchiefs pressed discreetly to their noses. Policing the act, fines, enforcement, and embarrassment. The beautification efforts coincided with more aggressive enforcement policies. By the 1680s, uniformed guards and ward inspectors were given the authority to issue fines for urinating outside of designated spaces. Signs were posted on certain street corners: Diurner ici sous peine d'amende, do not urinate here under penalty of fine. This led to the awkward and very Parisian emergence of urinal etiquette. Men were encouraged, often via pamphlets or sermons, to use respectable angles when relieving themselves, to aim with care, and to step aside politely when finished. There were even early cartoons circulated by moral reformers depicting ideal urinal posture: back straight, hat slightly lowered, hands appropriately arranged. A popular model featured a waist-high granite bowl built into a brick alcove, with a sloped drainage trough that ran down to the sewer ditches. The bowl was designed to be non-splashing, though the technology had limited success. Lemon peels, dried herbs, vinegar-soaked rags, and even burning incense were sometimes placed near or above the bowls. Merchants took to selling small sachets of lavender or mint to pedestrians, much like early 20th century vendors might sell chewing gum near busy train stations. By the reign of Louis XIV, Paris was being reshaped into a model of urban grandeur. Wide boulevards, formal gardens, and monumental architecture were becoming the norm. Filthy, stinking corners didn't belong in the Sun King's capital. One particularly inventive tract, titled Sur la du Soulagement, argued that relieving oneself was not shameful if the urinal could not be hidden. It could at least be rebranded, but a natural part of being civilized, so long as it was done in an appointed place at an appropriate hour with no undue flourish. This same period saw the standardization of certain urinal designs. Paris was still Paris. A gentleman might quietly step into a domed enclosure, adjusting his hat, pretending to admire the masonry. The flow of foot traffic, the distribution of vendors, and even the choice of public gathering spots were subtly influenced by where urinals had been placed or avoided. Meanwhile, an inspector might pretend not to notice at all. Some wealthier neighborhoods even experimented with urinals made from glazed terracotta, which were easier to wash and less porous than stone. But terracotta cracked easily in cold weather, and their adoption remained limited. Smells, scents, and sanitary deception. Despite all these changes, the urinals still smelled. To counter this, aromatic disguises became common. One satirical poet of the era referred to the urinals as the perfumed lies of cobblestone dignity. But there were practical reasons for this olfactory sleight of hand. The city wanted to maintain its prestige, so instead of removing them, the city dressed them up, masked the odor, and assigned ever more inspectors and cleaners to the task. The social performance of urination by the final decade of the 17th century. Relieving oneself in public had become a minor social performance, one that varied depending on your class, your confidence, and your location. A laborer might stand at A with one hand on his hip, greeting a friend in passing. In fact, the presence of these structures did more than just control bodily functions. They quietly shaped urban rhythms. This all raises a curious question. How did these humble installations eventually evolve into actual buildings, complete with plumbing, attendance, and, in some cases, music? And what role did 19th century designate a public obsession with ironwork play in creating the modern urinal? So far, you've witnessed the slow, scented evolution of Parisian urinals, from open-air gutters to modest architectural embellishments, and from nuisance to a minor symbol of urban pride. But our journey isn't quite over yet. As we leave behind the 17th century and drift into the 18th and 19th, something unexpected begins to unfold. The act of public urination, once hidden in shame or forced into awkward improvisations, slowly becomes institutionalized. It becomes regulated, designed, and perhaps most curiously made beautiful. By the end of this story, the humble will be reimagined as the Vespasiana cast iron monument to hygiene, order, and civic style. But how did we get from rough stone bowls and lemon peels to green-painted kiosks of Parisian legend? Let's follow the stream of history. The 18th century, planning begins. But slowly, urban planning had become a serious topic among intellectuals and magistrates. Many were temporary wooden stalls, occasionally decorated with panels or painted in neutral colors. Others were simply stone slabs installed in alley corners with a privacy screen. Maintenance was still spotty, but a new idea had taken hold. If people were going to urinate publicly, they ought to do it neatly. The corners had to be cleaned, and the city's new grandeur needed new amenities. Though the urinal problem persisted, the Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking about bodies, spaces, and cities. By the 1700s, Paris was a city in flux. The idea of sanitation as a public good began to emerge. Philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot occasionally referenced the filth of the city with ironic dismay. In private letters, one finds descriptions of Paris as both the pinnacle of civilization and an open sewer with galleries. Yet real change came only with pressure from below, specifically the middle classes, who were now numerous, mobile, and highly sensitive to matters of dignity and smell. His proposal included schematics, suggested drainage angles, and even budget estimates. The proposal was never fully adopted, but it marked a turning point. Bureaucrats were now thinking about the urinal not as a passive object, but as infrastructure. Throughout the 18th century, local ward officials continued to install new urinals in growing neighborhoods. In 1769, a reform-minded city official proposed creating a network of uniform public urinals to be funded by local taxes and maintained by assigned cleaners. Enter the Vespasian. Urination gets a brand. The true revolution came in the 19th century, under the governance of Georges Haussmann, the prefect of the Seine, who undertook the radical transformation of Paris under Napoleon III. As he raised old neighborhoods and built wide, straight boulevards with sewers, sidewalks, the smell had to go. Enter the Vespasian, named after the Roman emperor Vespasian, who famously taxed public urinals in ancient Rome and supposedly said, "Pecunia non allet, money does not stink." Many were semicircular or oval-shaped booths, open at the base but enclosed with decorative slats. Some were so ornate that tourists mistook them for shrines or fountains. The walls provided privacy while allowing ventilation. Most were painted dark green to blend in with trees and lampposts. Writers like Victor Hugo and Émile Zola wrote about them with contempt, calling them unsightly traps for the senses. But others praised them for their functionality and boldness, describing them as proof that Paris was finally a modern city. They were free to use, cleaned daily by assigned staff, and served as social landmarks for certain neighborhoods. Some Vespasians became informal meeting spots for gay men, particularly in the late 19th century, when such activity was policed but not always illegal. Others suggested charging a small fee to discourage loitering. By the 1890s, Newspapers carried stories about inappropriate encounters in urinals, and reformers demanded action. Postcards depicted them, jokes were made about them on stage, and novels included scenes of whispered conversation or clandestine meetings at their iron gates. This added a new layer of controversy, and officials began to debate how to monitor usage without disrupting privacy. These new structures were cast from ornamental iron and placed at strategic points along Paris's boulevards. Indoor plumbing had improved, offered more amenities, and attitudes toward public decency shifted. People wanted privacy, cleanliness, modernity. There were no doors and no flushes in early models, but they were dignified in appearance, sometimes featuring small domes, floral motifs, and footrests. By the 1870s, there were over 400 Vespasians across the city. A handful have been preserved as curiosities or museum pieces, their once proud green slats rusted and quiet. Most people walk past them without knowing what they were. Ironically, while the Vespasians improved urban hygiene, they also became a subject of ridicule and discomfort. Surveillance, subtext, and scandal, a place where, centuries ago, men paused for a moment of relief while the city bustled around them. And yet, through their slow evolution, we see something profound: the human desire to bring order to even the messiest of necessities. Despite their utilitarian nature, the Vespasians were also charged with social meaning. Because they were men-only spaces, they became flashpoints in discussions about class, morality, and even sexuality. Several proposals included installing attendants or reducing enclosure height. Perhaps tired from walking, ducking into a green iron urinal, letting out a sigh, and returning to the bright, busy street. At the same time, the Vespasian had become a cultural icon. They were no longer just urinals. They were part of the civic landscape, woven into the daily rhythms of the city. The decline of the iron urinal by the 20th century, the Vespasian began to fall out of favor. By the 1960s, most of the Vespasians were being dismantled or replaced with enclosed, automatic public toilets. The age of the open-air urinal was ending. Today, very few original Vespasians survive in Paris. But if you look closely, perhaps, at the edge of an old square or near a long-forgotten passage, you might still see the faint outline of a urinal niche in the stone. A final reflection: the history of Parisian urinals may seem absurdly minor. From medieval finds and open drains to iron pavilions with sculpted brackets, the act of relieving oneself became not just a matter of biology, but a reflection of politics, class, aesthetics, and infrastructure. And so we end not in grand battle or royal intrigue, but with a quiet moment of everyday life-a-man. Because sometimes history doesn't move in revolutions. Sometimes it trickles. It is the 1st century BCE, and you are standing on the Forum Romanum, the beating heart of the Roman Republic. Marble temples gleam in the Mediterranean sun. Merchants hawk their wares. Senators in spotless togas stride between columns, trailed by slaves and scrolls. At first glance, your eye is drawn to the Grand Rostra, where Cicero once thundered. The basilicas, where deals and lawsuits unfold like theater. But look closer, down along the colonnade's edge, near the shadow of a column, or beneath the overhang of a merchant's awning. There you will find a man, sitting cross-legged on a folding stool, with a wax tablet balanced on his lap. Though many elite citizens were taught to read and write, vast portions of the Roman population, including freedmen, merchants, and soldiers, could not. And even among the literate, the ability to write with precision, speed, and legal formality was considered a technical skill. He dips a stylus into a tiny ink pot made of bronze and begins writing. This is a public scriber, publicus, or notariusa, man trained not for war or oratory, but for the essential, deeply dull business of putting words onto paper for those who cannot. They could be found in the forum, at markets, near temples, or outside courtrooms. Welcome to the unglamorous, indispensable world of bureaucracy in ancient Rome, a world that, while rarely celebrated in marble or poetry, formed the backbone of one of history's most influential civilizations. The ones who sat with stylus and scroll in hand, waiting for the next illiterate citizen to approach with a plea, a problem, or a parchment, who were the public scribes. He was part clerk, part lawyer, part secretary, and very much a fixture of Roman daily life. The scribe used a stylus metal bone, or wood to inscribe temporary messages, which could later be wiped and reused. These were costly, so scribes charged accordingly. In ancient Rome, literacy was a privilege, not a right. That's where public scribes came in. For official scribes, tables and benches were sometimes provided by the forum's authorities. A public scribe was a professional writer available for hire by anyone who needed to draft a document, copy a letter, record a legal case, or conduct business in writing. There were several types. These men often worked in magistrates' offices, courts, or military commands. They enjoyed a relatively stable income and some degree of prestige. Scribi publici, official state scribes employed by the Roman administration. Notari and actuary, private or freelance scribes who offered services to individuals in public spaces. It is this second group, the street scribes of the forum, we will focus on today. Tools of the trade. The typical public scribe traveled light, but with tools of critical importance. Wax tablets, small wooden frames coated with wax, used for quick notes and drafts. Ink and papyrus. For final documents, the scribe used ink made from soot and resin, applied with a reed pen onto papyrus scrolls or sheets. A folding stool or bench. Many worked outdoors and needed to set up wherever space was available. A collapsible stool allowed for mobility and quick relocation. A portable writing desk. Some carried a small lap desk for longer work or used their knees. While not wealthy, experienced scribes could earn a respectable living, especially those who built a reputation for accurate, fast, and discreet writing. A day in the life. The scribe's day began early, with no artificial light and harsh midday sun. Most business in Rome happened between dawn and noon. He would walk to the forum or designated writing space, set up his bench, lay out his tools, and begin taking clients. A soldier might approach, wanting to draft a letter to a family member. The scribe would ask questions, scribble notes on a wax tablet, then carefully compose the letter on papyrus, complete with flourishes of formality. This was more technical. The scribe would know the legal formulas, the specific phrases required to make the contract binding. He might include witnesses, dates according to the Roman calendar, and references to local consuls. If the soldier couldn't read the letter once it was done, the scribe would read it aloud. But behind each letter lay the wheels of empire turning, contracts, wills, letters, decrees. Rome could not function without writing, and writing, for most people, meant a scribe. Inscriptions from Pompeii and Ostia, show that scribes sometimes sponsored local games or held festivals indicating they had a social presence, if not prestige. One inscription memorializes a scribe named Titus Scribonius, whose epitaph boasts of his fair hand, silent tongue, and loyal service to every class. Another references a Gaius Secundus, known for copying Virgil from memory in 12 sittings. And yet, for many scribes, writing was more than survival. It was a kind of stewardship of order. Next might come a merchant looking to draft a contract. A senator might rely on a scribe to prepare a document, then treat him like a servant. Scribes were often mistaken for slaves, though many were freedmen, former slaves, who had bought or earned their freedom and now earned an honest living. If a scribe erred in a contract, fortunes could be lost. If he recorded a will improperly, heirs might be denied. And so he wrote carefully, methodically. Boredom was a safeguard. Routines were rituals. Sometimes a petition to a magistrate needed drafting. The scribe would help frame the request in flattering, respectful language designed to please powerful ears. Other times, the scribe worked quietly, copying books for a fee, transcribing speeches, or assisting students who needed help preparing scrolls for exams or tutors. But their influence is everywhere, in the letters that survived, in the laws that governed, in the way Rome spread its voice across continents. A flourish of calligraphy, a joke in the margins, a note to the future. May this letter find you well, as I sit beneath the statue of Minerva, avoiding the sun. There was little dromage, the steady rhythm of ink and voice, stylus and scroll. Some had legal training or came from educated families fallen on hard times, social status, and personal lives. Public scribes occupied a curious position in Roman society. They were literate and knowledgeable, rare qualities in a world where most people could not read. They often spoke both Latin and Greek, and yet, because they worked for hire in public spaces, they were not highly respected by the elite. Some scribes banded together into guilds or collegia, which offered mutual aid, communal workshops, and protection from harassment. A few even became well known. The boredom and beauty of ink, the work was tedious. Long hours hunched over scrolls, endless repetition of legal formulas, the smudges of ink on robes, the sore fingers. In a world built on laws, land, and lineage, being the one who wrote the record meant shaping reality. Sometimes scribes slipped in personal touches. These men are mostly forgotten today. Their work ephemeral, their scrolls decayed. And yet, despite their importance, public scribes faced one constant challenge: how to protect their writing from fraud, theft, and forgeries. How did a Roman scribe verify a contract in an age before carbon copies? What tricks did they use to guard their scrolls and their reputations? In the dusty corners of the Roman Forum, or tucked inside a magistrate's office, a public scribe would bend over his scrolls, not just writing, but safeguarding the written word. Because writing in Rome was not merely communication, it was evidence, it was authority, and it was often disputed. So how did these scribes, most of whom worked alone, without legal backing or clerical immunity, protect their work in a world where scrolls could be altered, forged, or stolen? The answer lies in a blend of creativity, ritual, and a handful of clever practices that would be surprisingly familiar to any modern notary public. The problem of trust in a paperless world. People needed to know that a contract wasn't forged, that a will hadn't been tampered with, and that the person who signed a letter actually dictated its contents. In a society without ID cards, photocopies, or even surnames in the modern sense, verifying a document's authenticity was a daily challenge. He had no legal power to enforce agreements, but he did have methods. The scribe found himself at the heart of that challenge. Instead, they would use a signum, a mark or symbol, often drawn beside their name or pressed into wax with a carved ring or stamp. Signa, the ancient signature, the scribe would include this signum in the document, often noting, Marcus, who cannot write, gave this sign as his mark. They were proof of authorship. While literacy was uncommon, signing one's name was even more so. Most clients simply didn't know how. These subtle details could later be pointed to as evidence that a document was genuine or that it had been tampered with. For example, a client might choose a triangle, a fish, or a stylized animal as his personal mark. These rings were pressed into warm wax to create a seal at the end of a scroll or folded tablet. These seals, while not unique in the modern forensic sense, carried strong social weight. To forge one was a serious offense, sometimes punished by exile or mutilation. Some wealthy clients owned signet rings engraved with their family emblem or initials. Scribes kept records of commonly used seals and marks, and many included a note at the bottom of documents like written and witnessed by Lucius Petronius, scribe, on the 3rd day before the nones of April. This acted like a time-stamped witness, the scribe's own mark. Many scribes developed their own calligraphic flourishes or tiny maker S marks, not unlike a painter signing a canvas. These weren't decorative for important contracts. The scribe might insert an inconspicuous mark, a certain way of curling the letter R, a double underline beneath a number, or an idiosyncratic spelling of a common phrase. In legal disputes, scribes might even be called into court to verify their handwriting, much as modern experts are called in for signature analysis. The use of witnesses scribes didn't work in isolation. A typical contract, especially one dealing with land, marriage, or deed required witnesses, usually 2 to 5, depending on the region and type of agreement. These witnesses would sometimes also make a signum, or simply stand present as the scribe read the document aloud and confirmed it had been correctly recorded. A note would be added, in the presence of Publius, son of Titus, and Secunda, freedwoman of Julia. This informal network allowed a degree of accountability. If a question arose years later, a scribe might know where to find a witness or, at least, who could be bribed for their testimony. In legal matters, the outer and inner parts of the scroll might contain the same text. The outer layer could be read freely, while the sealed inner section served as proof if a dispute arose. If someone tried to alter the scroll, they would have to break the Sealan Act, easily noticed. Some scribes kept a witness roster, a running list of people known to them who had participated in previous contracts. Scroll security and storage for contracts and wills. Physical protection was also important. The document was later proven false when the original scribe's till alive and working was brought in, and testified that he never wrote it. Documents were sometimes rolled and tied with string, then sealed at the knot with wax. These were not standardized, but they gave scribes a way to reference old work-ons. More importantly, defend themselves if accused of complicity in fraud. Some scribes provided storage services for important documents. They might keep a chest or cabinetar Mariam in their office, temple, or collegium hall. Rumors of a mistake or a questionable contract would spread quickly, and clients would vanish. Since no formal licensing system existed, scribes relied entirely on word of mouth and street reputation. Let Rome remember his hand. These entries were engraved in wax or metal tablets and stored in locked repositories, guarded by officials. A contract might be stored in a dusty home alcove. A letter might be intercepted. A will might be challenged by jealous relatives. A scribe with a reputation for honesty might receive repeat business from magistrates, merchants, or entire neighborhoods. His bench would be passed down from father to son, and his name might be scratched into the bricks of his favorite forum pillar. A few large scribal guilds even leased space in archives, particularly in cities like Ostia or Lugdunum, where local administrations worked closely with scribes to maintain civic records. In cases of extreme importance like property titles or citizenship grants, scribes worked with record officials to submit a copy to the city archive or temple registry. The problem of forgery, even with all these precautions, forgery was a real and constant problem. A well-known example comes from a case during the reign of Augustus, in which a wealthy freedman claimed land based on a forged contract. The punishment for forgery varied: fines, exile, or, in rare cases, loss of the right hand, a symbolic and literal act of silencing the dishonest scribe or impostor. To protect themselves, scribes kept ledger books, called codices, in which they recorded the date, client, type of document, and amount paid. A reputation written in ink for scribes. Trust was everything. A dishonest or sloppy scribe, however, could be ruined overnight. One well-preserved epitaph found near Capua reads, "Here lies Quintus Vibius, scribe of good memory, whose contracts never brought shame, nor ink blotted the names of the worthy." And yet, for all their skill and caution, scribes could not always control what became of their work once it left their hands. What happened then, when things went wrong? What was the role of the scribe in court proceedings, disputes, and inheritance battles? The Roman Empire was built on conquest, law, and paperwork. Beneath the bronze-clad generals and marble-sculpted senators stood a quieter figure, the scribe whose ink-stained hands laid the foundation for much of Roman civic life. By the time the written word reached a courtroom or a magistrate's bench, it had already passed through the hands of the scribe, the witnesses, perhaps a notary or clerk, and been sealed, stored, or copied. But what happened when that process broke down? When disputes arose, memories faded, seals were broken, or worse, intentionally faked. This final section explores the role of scribes in Roman legal conflicts, from inheritance disputes to criminal fraud, and the curious way the written word became both weapon and shield in the empire's relentless pursuit of order. The courtroom and the clay tablet. A man stands accused of altering a loan contract. The original parchment written 2 years ago is produced. The ink is faded but legible. The seal looks disturbed. Imagine a magistrate's forum in the provincial city of Tarraco. Scribes were often called to testify, not just about what they wrote, but when, how, and under what circumstances. If they remembered the client, the agreement, the witness-sized details could make or break a case. If their handwriting could be confirmed, the document stood as evidence. If not, it might be thrown out. He is summoned from his shop. A typical will might read something like, "The magistrate squints." He asks the question that echoed throughout Roman courts for centuries. He leaves his vineyard to his freedwoman, Tiercia, and 20 denarii to the temple of Apollo. One was written by a town scribe, the other by a relative. Both claimed to be the final testament. The town scribe was brought in, swore under oath that he had written the document as dictated, and produced his ledger book showing the date and payment. Who wrote this? A name is mentioned: Decimus Celsus, public scribe. This was not uncommon. But in a world without photocopies or national registries, such decisions could turn on fragile threads: a smudge, a flourish, a vague memory. Wills and the fight over death. Perhaps no type of document caused more legal drama in Rome than testaments. Wills. Roman inheritance law was detailed, and heirs had rights, but only if the will was properly written, sealed, and witnessed. The slightest irregularity could render it void. Scribes specialized in these documents. Let it be known that Gaius Lucilius, in good health and of sound mind, dictated this testament to Publius Attius, scribe, on the calends of September, in the presence of Sextus and Minutia. But when the client died, perhaps years later, disputes might arise. Was this truly his last will? Were all witnesses present? Had the scribe been bribed? In one surviving court case from North Africa, two wills surfaced after a wealthy man's death. The magistrate sided with the scribe. Scribal errors and legal consequences, but scribes were not infallible. A misplaced name, a misspelled sum. This dual verification method was not legally required, but it reduced the risk of error and bolstered trust. An omitted witness, though not common. Some contracts included a clause stating, "These mistakes minor, as they seemed could unravel major deals." To avoid such outcomes, wealthier scribes worked in pairs, one dictating and the other copying. Many maintained notebooks full of contract summaries, witness lists, and client accounts. These codices became personal insurance policies, a way to protect themselves if a client later claimed fraud. Some scribes were bilingual, others relied on interpreters. Still, when a mistake occurred, the scribe could be held financially liable, especially if his error cost the client money. Should the scribe make error through negligence, he shall be fined half the disputed sum. This placed real pressure on scribes to be careful and also to keep good records. The role of language and interpretation. Rome was a multilingual empire. Latin dominated legal texts, but many clients spoke Greek, Punic, Aramaic, or Gallic dialects. Judges might favor official scribes' work over that of freelance scribes unless the freelance scribe had a sterling reputation and detailed personal records. Misunderstandings were inevitable. A client might dictate one intention, and the scribe, misunderstanding a phrase or using imprecise language, could commit them to something very different. By the 2nd century CE, scribes were employed in tax offices, military enrollment stations, and imperial archives. These roles came with more prestige and risk. To mitigate this, scribes often read the final document aloud, asking for verbal confirmation before sealing. It became a standard practice, especially in more diverse provinces. A forged army discharge paper could see a man arrested. These scribes were literate in Greek and Coptic, and their accuracy directly affected imperial revenue. Even so, some legal scholars in later Roman law codes warned, a contract is only as clear as the tongue that births it. Legal scribes versus public scribes. They were cheaper, more accessible, and often more familiar with everyday contracts. It's worth noting that not all scribes had equal legal weight. Public scribes were often attached to courts, magistrates, or municipal offices. Their records carried greater authority. It could not function without them. They could delay, alter, or misplace a document and with it shift the course of someone's life. And where quiet men with styluses and ink held enormous responsibility for recording the lives of others, private scribes operated independently, often out of storefronts or street stalls. In major disputes, the source of the document could matter as much as the content. Scribes in imperial administration. As Rome's bureaucracy grew, so too did the complexity of scribal duties. Some are barely legible, others are astonishingly clear. A minor error in a tax ledger could trigger an audit. A wrongly filed name might cost someone's citizenship. In the province of Egypt, for instance, papyri archives reveal entire teams of scribes managing land records and census rolls. Mistakes were not merely embarrassing, they were criminal. Scribes in these roles could face corporal punishment, even forced labor, if found guilty of deliberate fraud. The quiet power of the written word. Despite their humble stations, scribes held a subtle kind of power. They chose which words went on to the page. They interpreted the intent of those dictating. This was understood in Rome. Cicero, writing in defense of a client, once warned against trusting a document that had passed through too many ink-stained hands. And yet, the city needed scribes. From the back alleys of Pompeii to the forums of Carthage, from temples in Gaul to courts in Alexandria, scribes carried out their duties in the background, respected by some, mistrusted by others, but always present. What became of their work? Today, thousands of Roman contracts, wills, letters, and ledgers survive etched into stone, pressed into wax tablets, or inked onto fragile papyrus. What they reveal is a world not so different from ours. A world where documents could be trusted or doubted, where bureaucracy could help or hurt. So, as we wonder at the Roman roads, aqueducts, and colosseums, we might also pause to consider the quiet genius of their paper trails. Because, in the end, what is an empire, if not a story written down? You're walking the cobbled streets of Paris in the mid-1600s. The air smells, how shall we put this, fermented, not from bread or wine, but from the unmistakable presence of urine. For centuries, relieving oneself outdoors was a regular part of city life. But as Paris grew, its population swelling past 400,000, so too did its hygienic challenges. It's everywhere, pooled in alleys, staining the base of stone buildings, steaming slightly in the morning chill. This isn't a sign of disorder, though. This is normal. What did it mean to manage public urination in an age without sewers, sanitation laws, or privacy? In this first section, we explore how the city functioned before the urinal, the culture of public relief, and the early attempts to control one of humanity's most basic needs, the city before toilets. To begin, it's important to understand that there were no toilets, not in the modern sense. The average Parisian household lacked running water, and if you were poor, you also lacked a chamber pot. Even when you had one, emptying it was an adventure of its own. Paris, like many early modern cities, operated with a kind of unspoken agreement. Yes, the streets might smell, but it was a small price to pay for convenience. The solution: men simply walked to a discreet corner, turned their backs, and handled their business. Some did it in alleyways, others in stairwells, churchyards, behind market stalls, or up against the corners of bakeries and butchers. Go outside. Relieving oneself against a wall was a commonplace act, and not a particularly shameful one. There were no signs telling people not to. No lat, least initially prohibiting it. Popular streets reeked by midday. Shopkeepers complained of stained storefronts. Church officials protested the befouling of their outer walls. Women, increasingly vocal in the city's public sphere, petitioned for cleaner conditions. During heavy rains, this filth pooled in lower neighborhoods. During dry spells, it crusted and dusted into the air. By the mid-1600s, Paris was essentially a multisensory assault, especially in summer. But the cultural norm was surprisingly forgiving. City life involved filth, and most people accepted it as part of daily reality. The language of relief, of course, a behavior this widespread, had its own vocabulary. In 17th-century French, one could say aller to go to the waters, faire la petite besogne, to do the little need, say s'alléger contre le mur, to relieve oneself against the wall. Men did this openly. Women, more discreetly, used long skirts or servants to provide cover, until they didn't. A growing problem as Paris urbanized. The problem became visible in new ways. It wasn't just about dignity. It was about urban health. Urine in the streets mixed with mud and animal waste to create a slippery, disease-friendly muck. City officials took notice. The first laws in 1663, the Paris police lieutenant issued a ban on public urination near churches and monuments. This was not a sanitation policy, was a matter of respectability. Repeat offenders risked being publicly shamed or worse, temporarily jailed. Sacred spaces, they argued, should not be soaked with bodily fluids. After all, who would chase down someone midstream? And where, pray tell, were they supposed to go instead? Violators could be fined, but enforcement was tricky. The city didn't build many. In fact, most were created by private entrepreneurs. And while they helped, they didn't solve the core problem. These were small wooden booths, occasionally placed near marketplaces or busy streets, where one could relieve oneself behind a curtain. That's when things got creative. The rise of the daïsence, before the official urinal, came into being. Paris experimented with the daïsence, literally, a place of ease. They were semi-private and often maintained by an attendant, usually a poor man or woman, who charged a few sous and cleaned up after. They were too few in number, too expensive for the very poor, often so foul themselves that few dared use them so. Despite these efforts, the walls of Paris remained soaked, graffiti, paint, and stone spikes. The idea was that no decent Christian would urinate on a holy symbol. By the 1680s, frustrated landlords and parish councils took matters into their own hands, just function over form. Now, at last, there was an alternative to walls, alleys, and stairwells, until the symbols became too common and people stopped caring. But these were mostly symbolic. A determined person could find a gap or simply shift their aim, because what started as a simple urinal would, over the next century, become a symbol of modernization, surveillance, and even class identity. Some began painting sacred images like the Virgin Mary or the crucifix on walls known to be popular relief points. It worked for a while. Next came stone spikes, small sharp ridges carved along the base of public buildings to make standing close uncomfortable. By the late 17th century, the problem of public urination had become one of the most discussed minor problems in urban planning. The city needed something better. The first public urinals, and so, in 1682, the first public urinals, known as, were introduced. They were humble structures at first, Simple stone basins with a small screen for modesty, placed in public squares and near major streets. No roofs, no walls. They were cheap to build, easy to clean, and more importantly official. People used them, some grudgingly, some gratefully, and city officials rejoiced. At last, a clear place to go. But the story doesn't end there. How did a stone basin evolve into a key part of Parisian civic pride? And what about the women?